Hi there. Let's talk about the principles and elements of design and how they are the fundamental language that we all use in the creative arts. Whether we're working as graphic designers or artists, photographers, filmmakers, we all use one version or another of the principles and elements of design as we compose our pictures. So the first principle we're going to talk about is what we call balance. And so this is the visual weight of an object, the distribution of items in an image. And in this case, we use words like symmetrical or asymmetrical to describe those elements. So on the one side, you see a symmetrical pattern where the visual elements are laid out equally on both sides. Or you see the asymmetrical pattern where something is off center. One side is larger or stretched opposite of the other. These arrangements aren't good or bad, they're just different, and it's important to understand why they're different and what they would be best used for. Contrast is another very important principle in understanding how we see and interpret visual images. So in terms of contrast, these two images side by side show a very extreme contrast. You have light versus dark, you have bold red versus black, white, and gray. Those create a very optimal contrast between the elements. So items are visually distinct from one another. You can see their edges, you can see the positive and negative space, and you can really clearly see what the image is. Contrast is how we see images clearly, and it can be used effectively by either increasing or diminishing contrast. Again, there isn't a right or wrong, it's just a dial. We dial it backward and forward a little bit as needed to improve our images. And that's a really important thing to understand about these principles is they're meant to improve our work. So when something isn't working in your design or your photograph, one of these principles will probably fix it or help it. Movement. Movement is an interesting thing to talk about when thinking of static images. You know, we're not actually dealing with animation or film. What we're talking about is a static photo or a static image or a static graphic that has no inherent movement. But visually, the objects look like they're moving or they give you the impression of movement. And that's important, especially when you're trying to, convey a story, you're trying to convey a meaning. In this case, I find it really fascinating that these shapes really are abstract. There's just a circle and a couple swooshes, but we totally get it. We understand that these are dancing figures. They look like they're making expressive poses, they're dancing, they're moving. It's interesting how your mind fills in that information. Even though literally it does not look like a person, they're not arranged like people, but you get that impression and you read it immediately and you know what it is. And that's a really powerful principle that you can use when developing your visuals. Emphasis. Now, this is really important because as a visual artist or a designer, we're storytellers. We're trying to convey a specific meaning in a specific way. We want our audience to view things the way we intend them to see them. That means we need to, push them in a particular direction. We need to attract them. We need to force them to look at a certain thing. And we do that by creating emphasis. So we emphasize certain things and we de-emphasize others so that we know that we're getting that person on target. They're seeing exactly what we intend them to see and they're getting the message. And that's all done by constructing emphasis. Of course, this is a very simple example where we've got something, bold red in the midst of black and white rings. That's like a magnet. It's going to attract your attention. There are other ways to create emphasis in a visual. In fact, using some of the other principles will help you create emphasis, whether it's using balance to force us to funnel our vision into a certain area, or whether it's using movement, contrast. All of those elements are used, principles are used to create that emphasis. Rhythm. Here's another one that might be confused with movement, but it's more thinking of pattern and rhythm where you have repeated things. And that can be pleasing visually to see something that repeats and then there's a nice, smooth pattern that develops over time. And so that rhythm is another powerful principle that can be used to create something interesting to look at, something that has variety and is attractive. Another principle is unity. And this one can be described in a variety of ways, but using this picture, I think the way I would describe it is that all pieces and principles are put together in a cohesive way to carry a message. So you can see a variety of principles visible in this picture, but they all work together. So for example, movement. I see movement in the way the feathers are falling down around the figure. You can see them in motion. Even though they're static, you can tell they're floating. You can see that by the way they're arranged, by the way they break the picture frame, they're moving. Rhythm is another thing you see in the hair, the way it's designed with the rhythmic pattern. It gives you that, backward and forward, positive and negative space. It's an interesting visual that creates the impression of her hair. And then contrast. Look at the contrasting colors. You have an interesting contrast between the bluish green tint and the reddish pink tint of the skin tone. Contrasting, in this case, complementary colors working together. And then the balance of the picture is actually asymmetrical. She's not dead center in the middle. She's kind of off to the side just a little bit, asymmetrical, but it still has a nice, comfortable balance to it. Last but not least, emphasis. You look right into her eyes. And that's a natural human characteristic. We tend to look at people in the eyes. That's how we read and communicate. But that's very clear. Everything is kind of pointing to her eyes, and they draw you in that emphasis. What I find interesting is, even though there's some bold reds in this picture, they're not too overpowering. You still look at her eyes. So all of those things together create a cohesive image that works and uses all those principles in a unified way. And I think that's really nice. Now let's focus on some of the elements, some of the building blocks of design. The most basic principal element is line. Line quality is everything. Lines could be used to describe a form, an edge, a graphic perspective, anything really. Line quality is really critical, whether it's a straight line, a curved line, or an undulating line. Line quality is everything. In fact, it's one of my favorite things about vector art in particular, or inked art, is seeing the line quality and how it emphasizes and de-emphasizes certain things, and it creates a form. So paying attention to line quality is really important as an artist, if you like to draw, but then also as a designer, as you compose things. Do things have borders? Do they have edges? Do they have frames? Those lines become really important. Next is shape. Shape is critical. Shape is everything. Whether it's how shapes describe a simple logo or how they describe a beautiful sculpted object. Shape is really critical in understanding how we see things. And human beings have the unique ability to actually recognize a shape and see something as a logo. Here we have the Apple logo, iconic, easy to recognize, bold, and simple. But that shape implies so much. We're familiar with it. We know so much about it. So we have a relationship with it. And it's really interesting how the human mind can do that with icons and logos. And so being able to craft and design an image that becomes a shape that implies something more powerful than itself is a really unique skill. Color. I always like to say that, to me, color is like the music applied to a movie. If you've ever tried to watch a movie without a soundtrack or without a musical score, it's a very different experience. Music brings everything into the entertainment. It helps us understand what characters are thinking or what's happening in the scene. Color is exactly the same. It it makes everything make sense. And so being able to use color in an effective way to tell a story or to decorate an object is really important. And I find it fascinating to study how different color combinations work and how attractive they are to the human eye. And here you have an example of a colored illustration. It has so many different aspects to it. It's bright and colorful and interesting. And pay attention to color in everything you do. Color can take a mediocre piece and make it, you know, over the top good if it's done right. Paying attention to how you use color, critical. Value. Value is kind of a cousin to contrast. It's related. You know, you're trying to figure out how to create kind of a spectrum of value from light to dark. And that's useful in being able to render subjects, whether it's in a black and white photograph or a black and white illustration or a pencil drawing. When you're trying to use value to describe the properties of an object, it's really useful. So in this case, you have a really bold delineation between light to dark. And the value is what gives you the impression and tells you what the surface subject is. So, you know, the gray tones, the muted tones of the jacket, you almost feel the fabric and you can tell what it's made of. Just like the bold value in the hair, where it goes from really dark to light, and you can see that it feels kind of wet or glossy. And then kind of the overexposed value of the skin tones. And you can see how it really encapsulates the portrait in a very unique way. And good solid illustrations, paintings, photographs have a really broad spectrum of value from light to dark. It's very clearly delineated in an image. Space. So how do we deal with positive and negative space? So did you see Wolverine or did you see two Batmen? It all depends on your perspective and what you see. And so here you have that play on positive and negative space, whether it's something in the foreground or something in the background, or whether it's the way your mind kind of interprets what you see. It's interesting how visually in two-dimensional form, we can encapsulate a larger space and see more than what meets the naked eye. So here you have that play on that positive and negative space, whether it's the orange and yellow that attracted your attention or the black. Seems to be about 50-50 if you see Batman or Wolverine first. Space is also how you imply perspective. It's one of those visual cues that you use to play with that perspective in two-dimensional form. Texture is another really crafty element that you can use to indicate the surface texture of objects and to make variety and make an interesting design by adding texture. Whether you're working in Illustrator where you don't get to use a lot of texture, or whether you're in Photoshop where you can grunge things up, a texture is a really cool way to add some visual interest to your images. Form. This one I think is similar to Unity in that, Unity was using all of the principles to kind of unify your image. In this case, I think Form uses many of those principles and elements to create a complete subject, a complete image, a complete portrait. In this case, we have this beautiful girl, and she's designed and illustrated to look this way, but it looks three-dimensional, quote unquote. It doesn't look like a 3D object or a sculpture, but it's a visual optical illusion. It's a flat 2D surface that's designed to look like it has form. So you can see kind of the color and the shadows and the highlights and how they create the form of her face. Then you have the way that the elements and the principle of rhythm is used in the hair to create depth. You can see that shadow where the hair seems to be in the background and the foreground, and all of those pieces come together to create that depth. And it's all, again, an optical illusion. it's a flat surface, but it's made to look like it has dimension, like it has beautiful form. And that gets into another question about how do you actually create a beautiful form, and what are the elements of beauty and what makes something look beautiful, whether it's the shape of the eyes, the shape of the lips, the color choices, the shape of the face, the proportion, the balance or the symmetry of the features. Those all go into playing with how you can create something that looks beautiful. And so paying attention to form, how you use it to make something look one way or another is really important. And so basically, all of these principles and elements are used in one quantity or another to create our pictures and our images, whether it's vector art, whether it's photography, or whether it's painting. We're using them to make better work. And that's how I'd like you to think of these principles and elements, is they're tools. They don't always have to be used. They don't all have to be used at the same time. But when they work together in concert, kind of like an orchestra, they come together and they complete the picture and they make it work. So if you find yourself in a situation where your artwork isn't working, where your design isn't quite right, well, usually one of these elements or these principles needs to be improved. So keep that in mind. So hope that helps, gives you a good understanding of how to talk about and communicate about art. And that's the little lesson for today. Thanks.